Who'd have thought that Ted Williams could actually write short books? And they're pretty good. Cheers. Welcome back, everybody, to me talking about books, and this is the next time we will be talking about Osten Ard by Ted Williams. In this case, we'll be talking about The Last King of Osten Ard's prequel, or the postscript to the Memory and Sorrow and Thorn trilogy in 4 books, sort of, and that is, of course, The Heart of What Was Lost, published in 2017, and it's sort of a, well, for Ted Williams, it's probably a novella. For other people, it's a novel that bridges the gap between those 2 series. And yeah, it's short for Williams, and it's really good. And we'll do the thing that I always do, which is I'll give you a quick synopsis. If you have read Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn, you should definitely go and read this one. If you have not read them, I am not sure if you need to read this before you start The Last King of Osten Ard, that being The Witchwood Crown, the first one there. I don't know, because I haven't read The Witchwood Crown yet, so we will find out together. But if you have read Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn, this is sort of a postscript and a very powerful one. So I'll give you a quick synopsis, and then we'll move into spoilerish territory when I tell you why I think this is at least as good as the first the old trilogy in a lot of ways. So let's, do all of that, shall we? All right, so, well, what is this? As I said, it's sort of a postscript to the events of To Green Angel Tower in the Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn trilogy, and it covers events in the North. Because after the climactic battle of a, world-shattering epic fantasy series, there's still a lot of stuff that happens afterwards, because, happy ends may happen in fairy tales, but even they gloss over a lot of stuff. So this covers the events in the North, in Rimmersgard, with the defeated Norns, the Hikadea, fleeing to their fortress, and a human army following them, driving them there, and the question of what to do with the bad guys, so to speak, once they are defeated, is something that will come up in this novel a lot. It's short, it feels more modern in a lot of ways. It's pretty brutal for Ted Williams, and it's a short read that is very much closed off in itself, so you can read it as a standalone if you feel like it. And you should definitely go and read it, because it's entertaining, it's fast-paced for Ted Williams, it's got some interesting themes, and those are obviously surrounding war, the way of ending war, or the hope for ending wars, long-running enmities and hatred, how to actually get over those. These are sort of the themes in there, and it's as I said, it's a solid story with a good beginning, a good middle part, and a good ending, which is not necessarily something I expected from Ted Williams. Turns out, maybe he should just write short books. I don't know. We will see. Anyway, go read the book, and I'll meet you afterwards for the spoiler part. All right, you done with it? Perfect. I just reread it this morning, so we're good. Anyway, let's talk about why I think this all works very well, what Williams does in this book compared to other ones, and while this will be spoiler-ish, I don't think, even if you have not read it yet, you will lose much here. So let's talk about it. As I already hinted, with a gigantic, epic, sprawling thing like Memory, Sorrow, Thorn, it's sometimes difficult to find an ending. See, Lord of the Rings chose the whole, the Scouring of the Shire part, with Frodo and gang going home to the Shire and finding stuff needing, stuff that needs to be done there. And this is sort of, I guess, the way home and the Scouring of the Shire, but for Osten Ard in this regard. But it does go in different directions. And the first part here is, of course, that this was published in 2017, which makes it something like 20 years 20 years after the Memory, Sorrow, Thorn was done, basically, and, almost 30 years after the first book, after the Dragonbone chair was published. So a lot of things have happened in fantasy in between. We've seen, things become grimdark. We've seen things become more violent, more graphic, more bleak in a lot of ways. We went through A Song of Ice and Fire, or at least parts of it. We went through the first law. A lot of this stuff has happened. Fantasy has changed. Our media landscape has changed, and something else has changed. And I think that is another important part here. America, and this is an American book. Let's not forget that this is still an American book, because Ted Williams is very much an American writer in a lot of ways. America went back to war in a larger way. This is post 9/11, and I think you can tell this is post Afghanistan. This is post Iraq, and that kind of shows. It is very much a war novel in that regard, because once again, once you have a deciding battle, there's still a lot of people. What you do with the people that lost the war, what you do with those people once they are, trying to flee homewards. It's something that we've always struggled with. Like what you do with surviving Nazis, what you do with surviving, every time a war is over, the winners need to decide what to do with the losers, sort of. And this is something that we see here in a lot of ways, and we'll come back to that question later on. However, as I said, this is a war story, and it does follow the patterns of war stories. It focuses on normal people. The opening paragraphs being about Porto, a man from the south who hired on as a mercenary to make some money in the north, and he's meeting another countryman from his town, a younger man, and those two strike up a bit of a friendship, even though they have like local rivalries and stuff. And I think the way we do this reminded me, and this is probably because I've been reading a lot of World War I stuff recently, this reminded me very much of the way soldier memoirs or fictionalized memoirs like All Quiet on the Western Front portray that meeting of soldiers. It has a level of like this military fantasy or military fiction that you see in, parts of, say, the Malazan Book of the Fallen, or Glenn Cook's Black Company as well, where you have like average soldiers doing average things, focusing on average things, which is, finding food, keeping your boots, the leather of your boots soft, stuff like that. And it works really well, because one thing that a lot of older fantasy does not have is that focus on the normal, average people. Even, Memories of Thorn didn't fully have that. It has more of it than, say, Lord of the Rings, but it does still focus on a few main hero characters. And in this book, we obviously have some remaining characters from previous books, these being mostly Duke Isgrimnur and Sludig, his sort of lieutenant at this point. But mostly it's the average folks that have to, slog through the snow and don't even know why, and have to question why they are still soldiers, why they're doing this, running away from home, running away from some dark past, or just like disappointment at home, doing it just for the money. All of these questions, like why do average people go to war? Because these are not heroes; these are soldiers. And I think there's a massive difference between heroes and soldiers, even between warriors and soldiers. And you can see that in conversations between, say, Porto and his friend, whose name is Andrian or something like that, and some of the Northmen who have like this weird warrior culture. You can see that gap of understanding and the idea that this is war that has to be done, and then you get over it. And with that does come a lot of, suffering and graphic violence. Now, obviously, Memories of Thorn was already more bloody than, say, Lord of the Rings, once again. But this time around, yeah, people die. A lot of them die meaningless deaths. It's just something that happens in war. And I do very much appreciate Tad Williams making that shift, being able to take a world that still feels very much like Osten Ard. Obviously, we still have, Isgrimnur and Sludig in there. But moving it forward in the way he portrays in its sensibilities into the 21st century, taking a lot of things that have made their way into the general language of fantasy since the 1980s, incorporating them without losing the thing that makes Osten Ard feel like Osten Ard. And I think that's a difficult thing to do, but he manages it very well, and possibly the idea of having a shorter, more tighter narrative does help with that, because it allows him to play with these elements or incorporate these elements without having to go the next, I don't know, 5,000 pages or whatever the whole mess of Last King of Osten Ard will be when it's done. I think it works well in that regard. And it feels fresh. It's bleak, it's dark, it's much darker and bleaker in its overall tone than the Memory, Sorrow, Thorn series. But it does lack, and I think it's to its credit, it does lack, say, the cynicism, the irony, the dark sort of detachment that you see in something like a First Law trilogy by Joe Abercrombie. It is still very much the serious, sincere fantasy, just, paying more attention to the fact that heroism comes at a cost, and that cost is usually borne by normal people in a lot of ways. So that's something I personally really appreciated about The Heart of What Was Lost. And this brings us to the next big part, which is, of course, the Norns. Because in this book, for the first time, we actually get more of a perspective on the Norn society. We have Norn characters, point of view characters. Yes, we had like a few quick interlude things about Queen Utuku in later books of Memory, Sorrow, Thorn, but that's a very different thing than actually knowing anything about the society of the Norns and everything like that. This time around, of course, we have several Norn point of view characters, and once again, the main guy is a builder. He's actually not a fighter as such. He belongs to the guild, or they're called orders in Norn society. Apparently, he's a constructor. He's a builder. He's a creator in that regard, and he's also not the leader of his order, but a second in command, so to speak. So we learn that Norn society does have like a rigid caste system. It's also a slave system with human slaves, but also apparently there's like lower caste Norns that are just almost as bad as slaves, or like almost as bad off as slaves in that society. We don't get too deeply into it, but I think there's something that is interesting, because I need to use the F word here, by which I mean fascism. There's a level, and maybe that's because the both the Scythi and the Norns in a lot of ways have been slightly coded in a East Asian, somewhat Japanese way, with the way the language is used and stuff like that, the way they dress and so forth. That having that kind of society, that brutal military society with an actual ultimate leader at the top, in this case obviously a queen, so a monarch on top, and several like massive, the leaders of massive guilds, or whatever you want to call them, actually doing most of the ruling below that ultimate ruler. There's elements in here that, if you take that historic parallel too far, can lead to some very interesting conclusions. Now, why is this important? Well, I think it's sort of important because we're on a sort of interesting slope here. During Memory, Sorrow, Thorn, it's very clear that the Norns are the bad guys. Together with the Storm King, they want to kill everyone, each and every one. They want to take over the world, turn back time, and make it, and so forth. And they may have motives, and I mean they do have motives, but they're still sort of closer to your orcs and trolls and so forth under Sauron than they are to the very ambivalent sort of motives that you get with, say, the characters in A Song of Ice and Fire, or some of the characters, at least, in the First Law. To say nothing of, the Malazan Book of the Fallen or anything of that caliber. However, we're slowly moving forward with, down that slide into making our enemies understandable, which, the first part of that is actually showing their motives and showing their ideas and having their, society being withdrawn further and further into the mountain and still dreaming of a prior glory that needs to be restored. And that's certainly something that you find in a lot of fascist systems all over the place. I'm not calling them fascist as such, but there's this idea that you had a glorious time that you need to go back to when you rule the world, and obviously empire being the goal there. We've seen this happen before. The problem is that while we're going down that road, and we should probably get some understanding and so forth for the Norns and their motives more, well, they're still pretty dreadful, right? They're a slave society, like a rigid caste society. They're still not very likable, even though our main point of view character seems to be somewhat likable. Or at least torn between tradition and at least sort of glimmerings that traditions will actually lead nowhere. And I think that's sort of something that we'll hopefully find out more in the Last King of Osten Ard, that movement or the hope or the chance that Norn society can change in a way that will be helpful. Because as traditional as it is, yeah, as I said, it's still pretty dreadful. And what's his name? Vieki? I think that's his name. I'm really bad with those names. Anyway, Vieki being the person who sort of is torn between the admiration for the very problematic general and the need to actually build a future for his people. I think that's an interesting perspective. We're not quite at the point where he actually understands that a lot of things in the past, or like that traditional outlook, that ossified society is a part of the reason why the Norns are constantly failing and losing more and more, and how that is actually harmful to their own society. But he's slowly getting there, and the idea that this book ends with basically one way of ending a war, we'll get there in a moment, is sort of to have like timeout for everyone to kind of rethink their shit, I think is probably the best way to end this whole conflict. Because we need to talk about genocide, and I think it's important to understand this. Once again, history and fantasy are oftentimes intermingled, and after this kind of war, there is obviously the question what to do. What can the victors do with the defeated? And well, there's certainly parts of the human army that are for full-on genocide and killing every single last Norn. While on the other side, the Norns are like, well, let's regroup and then go and kill every single last human. And the question is, how do you solve that level of enmity, that level of like hatred because it can only lead to the annihilation of one people, and the question of like whether there is a way out or not. Now, Williams chooses the idea that there are ways to go out of that. The interesting part here seems to be that what needs to be healed sort of is the rift between the Scythi and the Norns, which is why certain people, certain Cherokee and whatever her name is, the city woman that runs around with Isgrimnor, are apparently cooking up this idea of meeting for a parley during which the hardcore fascist general gets killed by the rock slide. So we need to have humans and Norns need the intercession of the Scythi in this to create that point where well, they at least find a way to avoid immediate genocide or postpone that, and hopefully find ways to build a future in which both sides can at least coexist in a peaceful way. And I do appreciate the fact that the story does leave that open. It's a possibility. It's there's no happy end here. It's more like, well, those who are still alive can go home and build lives, and maybe if we all build lives and build up our societies, and we might come to a point where we don't think we need to actually eradicate the other, and sometimes that's enough, and sometimes that's all you can get, and I do appreciate that. The idea that it takes individuals to overcome their prejudices, in this case, that being the older, the master of the Builder Guild, who does actually do this, and the idea that their conspiracy happens out of very different motives. One of them thinking about the future, one of them just doing it out of power, one of them out of personal fear. All of that is interesting because the goal, or at least the outcome, is still a somewhat positive one. And yeah, for a book that is, 200, 300, 350 pages long, that's a lot of meaning packed into something by an author that usually seems to be unable to write books that are under 800 pages, so I'll take all of that. What else is important before we leave this for today? Well, there's a bunch of things that are still good and a bunch of things, small details that are not as good. I like the way he talks about trauma, the way once they both Porto suffering or grief for his friend who slowly dies, the point where his friend as an undead wakes up and instead of like fighting like all the other undead decides to go home. I think that's a very poignant scene there that I really, really appreciated. Once again, because I've been reading a lot of these World War One war fiction stuff. That one did very much strike a chord, and I really appreciated that part. It's sad, it's heartbreaking. I do like that. The way he talks about, Bragi, the one soldier, that the veteran that gets killed by the giant, and how they recognize him by his boots because he's always been caring for his boots, and that's what everyone notices about it. These are the small bits and pieces that feel like Ted Williams did read a lot of war fiction before he wrote this book, and that's cool. Or the idea of trauma or PTSD almost, with the other survivor of that giant attack just polishing the giant skull all the time and being sort of not there, or Grinborn after the loss of his son just sharpening his sword again and again and again and just losing all of these, all of his humanity in grief and trauma. I think having these glimpses in there made this book feel more, contemporary in a lot of ways, and more human than, Memory, Sorrow, Thorn, where we still saw most of the people as sort of heroes, flawed heroes with, nuance and so forth. But this feels more real in a lot of ways, more authentic, and I do really appreciate that. There is, of course, also the old problem: women are still bad characters in Ted Williams' books. I don't know. We don't get many female characters. We obviously get the general, but she's portrayed as, a very absolute character with no nuance. She's just a fighter. She's a true believer in genocide. Let's not forget that. A true fascist, believing in the old glory, and that's that. The only other female character with any depth we get is Vieki's wife. And she still sucks, because Ted Williams is not able to write good female characters in that regard. She's annoying. She's always thinking about, her glory, because she comes from a richer family. She's only thinking about that. She gets annoyed when her husband is, doing his job and so forth. Was that really necessary? If you have, one actually female character to turn her into that? I don't know, man. It just feels unnecessary at that point. With so much praise I have for this book, that bit just left me annoyed again. I don't know. What I did appreciate was that the older characters that we know, Sludik and Isgrimnor, did feel very much like continuations of something that Ted Williams wrote 25 years before that. So that's quite the achievement to get that tone right when talking about these characters. I did appreciate that. And beyond that, there's one thing that I found interesting, that the Norns have temples where they do all these rituals, light candles and so forth. But why? Temples require a religion. Who are they praying to? We don't know. It's not in this book, and I doubt if we'll ever find out. It's just one of those small bits and pieces that it's just was left hanging in the air. The idea of having an appendix, I did find interesting, because it does actually change world building bits from Memory, Sorrow, Thorn, especially when it talks about the people now called changelings, something we did not know before, and I think that's preparation for The Last King of Osten Ard. Obviously, the last book is called The Navigator's Children, which is exactly the Tinukadea, which we are talking about here. So there's something going on there. Another bit that I found interesting is the interjections by the Norn chronicler. They reminded me a bit of the Princess Irulan historical bits and pieces that are used to, interject, as chapter headings and so forth during Dune. Obviously, that kind of thing has been done before, but having a historian frame stuff always reminds me of Dune in that regard. And, I'm fine with that. I'm totally fine with that. So that's my thoughts on The Heart of What Was Lost. I did enjoy it, more than I expected. If you've read it, let me know what you think about it. We'll be continuing, obviously, with The Last King of Osten Ard, but probably that will have to wait until after Dresdmas, so sometime early on next year. So with that out of the way, once again, thank you all for watching. Thank you for, support. Like, subscribe, comment, do all of those wonderful things. And if you have time tomorrow, we'll be having a live chat with Nicola Griffith about Hild and Meanwood and Spear and other things. If you have time, join us for that. It'll be something special this near the end of the year, so please do that. And until then, I don't know. I'll see you around. Thanks and cheers.